Hello, today we will be talking to you about the extent racism affected minorities and how that has changed over time.
First of all, we need to know what racism really means to understand the question. Racism is the belief that all members of each race have characteristics or abilities specific to that race. Racism involves distinguishing certain races as inferior or superior to another race or races.
There has been many instances where people's internal biases affect their hiring decisions and how people can take racism to a level in which it gets in the way of someone's desires, hobbies, and even job.
Many people see racism as a general problem that simply affects how people interact with each other. But it is even more than that. It is a problem that goes into hurting someone's career and workplace just because they were born to a specific race. Racism is still evident since early times and is still evident to this day.
In the 1960s, racism existed and was extremely evident in the lives of minorities, and to this day, it is still evident in the United States and around the world. In the mid 1900s, most of racism was aimed towards blacks. However, at the same time, there was often racism that was aimed towards other races and even immigrants that came from various nations. In the 1960s, you can say that the whites had a better life than a black person. The average lifespan of a black man in the 1960s was calculated to be 7 years less than an average white guy. Black children also had half the chance to completing high school compared to a white child.
Another disadvantage that the blacks Americans had was that on average they only earned as half as much as the white Americans and were also twice as likely to be unemployed than the white population. Also, salaries of black individuals are about $3,000 less than the white individuals based on their yearly salary between 31,000 to 38,000.
Blacks were concentrated in the lowest paying, dirtiest, and most hazardous jobs. In the words of Lonnie Rowland, a worker at Firestone, there was an unwritten law that black people couldn't work high skilled jobs, couldn't have no top jobs operating no machine.
Besides having bad jobs, workers also had tough times with breaks. Often bathrooms were very far away and always dirty. Water fountains were also very dirty and the water was always warm. Federal Compress, which handles cotton, resisted installing electric fans even though black workers were sweating in concrete buildings that approached 100 degrees.
An example where you can see the white American children have a huge advantage over the black Americans was the Boston busing. The whites had more advanced resources than blacks, like gyms, classrooms, and books. Transportation to the white schools was more convenient. The government tried to do something about that and created more diverse classrooms. This caused a lot of dispute in the Boston community and started some violence in Boston. A very famous story in history that shows evidence of blacks wanting equal rights regarding jobs and other things was the March on Washington. The March on Washington was when 250,000 blacks and 60,000 whites marched for jobs and freedom as they felt that they didn't get what they deserved. This was the day that Martin Luther King gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream. They all came under the banner of jobs and freedom. Although slavery was gone during this time, the southern United States treated blacks as second class citizens. The purpose of the march was not only for better quality and higher wage jobs, but it was also a march to gain equal rights like same bathrooms, same water fountains, and same schools. The march is credited with helping pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where it helped decrease the discrimination against the blacks for jobs.
Now that we have talked about racism and how it has affected minorities in getting jobs back in the mid 1900s, we will now talk about racism in today's world. We will discuss how it has evolved and whether or not things have stayed the same.
In 2003, the Community Service Society published reports that 50% of the black men in New York City didn't have a job. And in 2005, another report demonstrating that there are 170,000 young adults ages 16 to 24 who are not in school and not working, largely black and Latinos.
Although racism has been a continuous issue for an immense amount of time, people have started to ignore it in today's world, thinking that the problem has just gone away. But it hasn't. It has just been shown in smaller doses around the world and for different reasons.
The unemployment rate of blacks, which is 15.7%, is the highest between Asians, 7.5%, whites, 8.7%, and Hispanics, 12.5%, based on a census in 2010. As you can see, black people and Latinos have always had a higher unemployment rate than other races.
Even now, still segregation still happens in schools and has been increasing from the 1980s till now. The percentage of schools with 50 to 100% of non-whites in them have only decreased by 2%, while there's been a 38% of schools where 90 to 100% of schools are non-white.
Another example of how racism has affected minorities is their abilities and chances of getting into a good college and later on getting a job in the real world. College education is a fundamental part for people to start their careers in high level and high wage jobs. Students started to alter their names so that they could sound more white as they started to apply to universities. Also, people realized that even after they graduated from college, it was still difficult for middle class black people and minorities to find jobs, even if they had come from an Ivy League school or good university.
Regarding education, a report from the advocacy group Young Invincibles suggests that African American millennial men need 2 or more levels of education to have the same employment prospects as their white peers, meaning a black man with a college education could possibly have the same level of job as a white man with only a high school education.
A study published in the American Economic Review reports that people with black surrounding names receive 50% fewer callbacks than those with white surrounding names.
Furthermore, the Great Recession, which was a time from the years of 2001 to 2009 that caused a decline in economic activity that affected many companies and people's jobs overall. This all started when the US housing market busted. This period had the greatest effect on black employees. Blacks had an official unemployment rate that was 50% higher than whites.
As you can see from this graph, white people have always had a higher wage than others. You can also see that throughout the years, they have increased the wages for white people, while for the blacks and the Hispanics, they have barely increased their wage. This shows that racism still exists in the world. In conclusion, racism was a huge problem back in the day, and it affected the minorities very much. It is still a problem today, but it is not as much as a big problem. We can still do a lot of things to make sure that all races have equal rights and that no racism exists in the world. However, we have much to go before we reach that state.